What does consciousness mean? How do we define it, and how do we scientifically measure it? Depending on who you talk to and which environment this topic is being discussed, it appears that we have different definitions when it comes to consciousness. However, as you already know, for something to be scientifically studied, we first need to define it, and also we need to come up with a way in which we can measure it, and also a unit where we can measure it, where everybody agrees on the same unit of measurement. And so this is one of the reasons where in the scientific world and the scientific communities, when they talk about studying consciousness, it usually means that a state of the mind being conscious, being able to think and act, to a state where a mind is unconscious, for example, being in a coma. In the past, scientists believed that consciousness is binary, meaning to say it's like a switch where you turn it on or off. So consciousness is either on or off. However, most recent studies have showed that that is not the case, as in consciousness is not something that you just switch on and off. It is a continuum transition of state of the mind. In other words, it starts from a transition from a state of consciousness, and gradually it turns into and transition into a state of unconsciousness. And so for that reason, this state of transitioning from one state to another has become extremely important and interesting for scientists to study. And so this type of shift in thinking and defining consciousness has become extremely important in conducting these studies, because we still have a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to the conscious mind. For example, what happens to consciousness when we sleep? What happens to consciousness when we go in a coma? We need to be able to define and measure this, and shifting our thinking from it not being a binary but a transitional continuum period definitely makes a huge difference in these scientific studies. Now, one of the main challenges in measuring this transition is, how do we go about scientifically to conduct and design these experimental studies without interrupting the participants? Because usually whenever you interact with a participant or a subject in a lab, you tend to interrupt the transition. And in this case, because we're talking about transition of a conscious mind, it's even more important to come up with methodologies and techniques where you interrupt this transition from conscious to unconscious the least. To address these issues, some scientists have adapted a very simple methodology that they call it the breathe and squeeze methodology. And the way this breathe squeeze technique works is that a small ball is given to each of the participants, and the participants are trained to breathe in at the same time squeeze the ball. And scientists then will be able to measure the number of squeezing of the ball, during which time period, the frequency in which the balls are squeezed, and also the strength in which the balls are squeezed by the participants in the lab. While this sounds like a very simple technique, it's quite brilliant in that it interrupts the least the transition from the participants going from consciousness to unconsciousness. It also helps researchers really define and measure as to what happens during this transition by, for example, measuring the strength of the squeeze and the frequency of the squeezes. Another great aspect of this technique is that these scientists were also able to measure the brainwaves frequencies of the participants while they were transitioning. And so, for example, while they were transitioning from consciousness to unconsciousness, both their brainwaves frequencies through EEG neuro headsets were measured, as well as, of course, the squeezing that we just talked about. Now, how did they get the participants go from consciousness to unconsciousness? These scientists administered sedative that are obviously approved, and these studies usually go through a tremendous process of ethics, etc. But they started to give these participants sedatives, and then they administered this sedative gradually. So very, very slowly they would give the sedative. So because in an experimental studies in the lab, you really need to control for every single variable, and in this case they were able to measure and the amount of sedatives given to the participants, and then at the same time measure the changes that were happening in their brainwaves frequencies as well as their muscular level, in this case squeezing. And it was during these techniques where scientists came to understand and realize the continuum aspect of the transition from consciousness to unconsciousness. Because as we talked earlier, traditionally scientists were under the impression that we're either conscious or unconscious, we're switched on and off. But with the help of these type of techniques that we just talked about, scientists are now able to see how the transition is actually a continuum transition, and it's happening quite slowly. Another very exciting part of this study was that when the participants came back to consciousness, they automatically, and without researchers interrupting them, remembered that they still need to breathe and squeeze. And so that was also very, very exciting and interesting for the scientists to measure, because they were able to not only measure and understand and quantify the onset of unconsciousness when the sedatives were given, but also the onset of consciousness, that is when participants came back to consciousness after the sedatives had worked. The researchers were also able to find evidence in terms of changes in patterns of brain frequencies through the EEG devices that they used, which was also extremely interesting because they were able to again look at the onset and offset of consciousness and during that transitioning period of time. These techniques, along with other techniques, are great stepping stones for us to keep evolving the techniques in which, for example, we measure consciousness. For example, these researchers are now planning on even bringing MRI techniques and MRI measurements. And so in this case, they would have additional data point to look at, not only the breathe and squeeze techniques, but also the data from EEG as well as the data from the MRI machine. And with these evolution in techniques and measurements of data gathering, we can hopefully evolve and become better and better at not only measuring consciousness, but also defining it, because we do need to come up with a definition where everybody agrees, and also a unit of measurement where everybody agrees. And of course, these are also great stepping stones in terms of evolving our techniques into understanding our human brain better and better.